There was a strange silence in the room, broken only by the sound of cloth tearing and fire crackling. The fabric was soft old, soaked in dried sweat and the faint smell of blood. One by one, they cut it into pieces, the last clothes he ever wore, and dropped the shreds into a fire. These were not just clothes, they were relics, and yet they were burned like cursed objects. Ash rose into the air like black snow, and everyone stood still, whispering like they were inside a cathedral. No one spoke his name, not loudly, not anymore. The men who burned the clothes were the last people alive who had seen him, seen what he became. They looked terrified, not of the clothes, but of the memories. Memories of a man who had once been untouchable, powerful, almost divine. And then, something broke inside him. He used to speak to crowds with fire in his voice, but in the final months, he spoke to walls. He screamed at invisible enemies. He whispered to ghosts. He forgot names, faces, even his own title. They say he stopped bathing, stopped eating, stopped sleeping, but never stopped talking. He talked to the dead. He cursed the living. His body began to collapse in ways no one could understand. His skin changed color. His eyes swelled. His breath smelled like something already rotting. Doctors came and went, but no one stayed. The room smelled of fear and something worse, something unnatural. And yet, he wouldn't die. For weeks, he lay there, sweating, shaking, growling like an animal. They tied him to the bed. Some say he bent the wood with his bare hands. Others say he tried to eat his own fingers in the middle of a fit. He called out for people who had been dead for years. He claimed to see them, in the corner of the room, smiling, waiting. By the time death finally took him, it was a relief. But it was not peaceful. His mouth was open, eyes wide. They say he died mid-scream, his jaw locked, his tongue black, his hands clenched around the bedsheets like he was trying to hold on to something. Or someone that wasn't there. No priest wanted to bless the body. No servant wanted to touch it. They wrapped it in cloth without washing it. The clothes he died in were soaked with the fluids of madness, sickness, and something they refused to name. And still, some believed those clothes were sacred. A warning, a reminder, maybe even a part of a prophecy. Some begged to preserve them. Others demanded they be destroyed. In the end, they burned them. Not out of hate, not out of love, but out of fear. The ash was gathered and thrown into a river at night. Not a single word was spoken. It was like the man had never existed, but he did. He lived. He ruled. He suffered. And before all of this, before the madness, before the isolation, before the death, he was a man that the world followed blindly. A hero, a king, a god in human form. So how did it all go so wrong? They said he was born during a thunderstorm, not a scream, but silence when he entered the world, as if even the sky had stopped to watch. From the beginning, there was something strange about him. Not strange in a bad way, strange in a way that made people stop and stare. He was beautiful, even as a child. Striking eyes, pale skin, hair so black it looked blue under the sun. People whispered that he was too perfect, too calm. While other children cried or stumbled, he would sit and watch, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He didn't speak much, but when he did, everyone listened. Even adults. His tutors called him a natural-born thinker. His mind was sharp, fast, but not arrogant. He never bragged. Instead, he asked questions that made grown men uncomfortable. Questions about life, war, death, power. What makes a man follow another man? He once asked at the age of 10. Fear or love? His voice didn't tremble. He didn't blink. As a teenager, he walked like a man twice his age, tall, straight, unshaken. He spoke several languages. He memorized texts in days. He trained with soldiers until his hands bled and never once cried. He didn't need to be the strongest. He just needed to be the one others followed. And they did. By 17, he was already leading men. By 20, he was winning battles, not through violence, but through strategy. He saw moves before they happened. He knew how people thought. He knew what made them tick, what made them break, and what made them kneel. His enemies feared his mind more than his sword, and his allies followed him not just because he was skilled, but because he made them believe. He had a gift of words, of presence. In a room full of kings and generals, it was him people looked at, even when he said nothing. They say when he walked into a hall, the air changed. People stood straighter, smiled wider, and yet he never demanded it. He simply was that powerful. He hated lavish parties. He rarely drank, but when he did speak, in public, he spoke like fire. Crowds wept at his speeches. Soldiers kissed his feet. Women wrote poems about his eyes. Men called him the second coming of greatness, a living legend. Some even whispered the word divine. He never called himself that. Not yet. He built cities. He wrote laws. He freed slaves. He punished corrupt rulers and forgave rebels who begged for mercy. He didn't just rule, he inspired. Paintings of him filled temples and homes. Coins bore his face. Children were named after him in every corner of his growing empire. He was more than a leader. He was a vision, a future, a myth still alive. And with all his power, all his glory, he still showed mercy. When a general disobeyed his orders and lost thousands of men, the punishment should have been death. But instead, he asked the man to sit at his table and explain why he chose what he did. A dead man learns nothing, he said. A humbled man learns everything. Even his enemies respected him, even as they died by his command. But greatness has a cost, and his grew heavier with each passing year. The more land he conquered, the more men he needed to trust. Trust, for someone like him, was dangerous. Not because he was paranoid, but because he understood the weight of betrayal before it even happened. He could see it in a man's hands, his silence, his smile, and still, he rose. Higher and higher. He built monuments not to himself, but to the people, the victories, to the dead. He visited his soldiers in the field, ate with them, slept near their tents. He never forgot where power came from. Not gold, not titles, but loyalty. Real loyalty. But in private, things were different. There was a shadow in him, something no one saw or wanted to see. Late at night, he would stare at maps not with hunger, but with fear. He wrote letters to himself, notes in the margins of books that made no sense. Words like, "What if I am wrong? What is left when there is nothing more to take?" Still, the people never doubted him. They built statues, sang hymns. They believed that as long as he ruled, they would be protected from chaos, from darkness. Time itself, he was their shield, their sword. Saint in human form. And then came the moment the world bowed. The moment he was crowned not just as ruler, as something more. Title that no man had claimed in centuries, that belonged to the gods. It wasn't forced. People wanted it. They begged for it. They needed it. He accepted, slowly, with tears in his eyes, not out of arrogance, out of the crushing weight of what it meant. He had reached the peak. The world knew his name. The stars bore his symbol, and death, it seemed, had forgotten him. Power, true power, always asks for something in return. And when it came to collect, would take everything. He rode into battle like a storm of confidence, shield shining under the sun. Soldiers cheered. His enemies scattered at the sight. He believed he was invincible, not because he was careless, because fate had favored him before. That day, fate shifted. First, it was just a scratch, barely a cut on his arm. It was enough to disturb him, enough to make him pause. They called it a minor wound. Medics stitched it, cleaned it, and sent him back into command. Inside that wound, something dangerous began to grow. Shook it off, laughed it off, spoke to his men hours later, praising their bravery as if the cut were nothing. Didn't want them to worry. Never did. A week later, the pain turned. Fevers, chills, hallucinations in the dark hours. Began to see his victories turn into graves, each fallen soldier's face mocking him in every corridor of his palace. Doctors wrote it off as exhaustion. Advisors blamed stress. He knew. Felt death creeping inside him, disguised as weakness. Around the same time, whispers started in the court. Trust, his most sacred currency, began to vanish. General, once saved from disgrace, had been plotting behind the scenes. Trusted friend had taken gold from the treasury. A woman in his inner circle spoke to enemies in secret. Saw shadows in loyalty. Every smile looked forced. Every bow seemed cursed. Evening he entered the throne room, expecting his generals to salute him. Instead, they held stiff faces, avoided his eyes. Asked why. One man couldn't meet his gaze and mumbled about new alliances. Other bowed and whispered, "We care for you, sire." Words rang hollow. The moment he realized that love and loyalty were fragile things, breakable by fear or greed. At the same time, his mind tumbled into darker places. Started writing his own fate in journals, notes about betrayal, about curses, about destiny. "I die," one line. Read, "Will they worship me? Burn me?" Hid those notebooks under his bed. Already feared the answer. Meanwhile, the wounds grew festering. Gangrene set in where he'd been cut. His arm turned black, swollen. Doctors refused to amputate, both afraid and uncertain. He begged them to try. They delayed. The infection spread upward, closer to his heart. An illness born from negligible care became a death sentence. He was still expected to appear strong. In public he stood tall. He covered the smell with incense, hid the swelling with heavy sleeves, forced a smile for the crowd. No one complained, no one dared. His fame had become a burden to all who followed him. They whispered prayers behind closed doors. They poured offerings at temples that had his symbol. They still believed in him. Even as he was dying, irony twisted through his life. He who had freed slaves and spared enemies found himself enslaved by infection. He who had shaped destinies now watched his own future erode. He who inspired fear in battle now cowered at the sight of his own hand. Power had been his ally. Now it mocked him. When news arrived from conquered lands that enemies had revolted, his generals asked what they should do. He dismissed one advisor harshly. In anger, he struck the table. The pain in his arm shot through him like dagger fire. Benjamin, his closest confidant, cradled him in secret, muffled his screams, but the damage was done. Other aides heard. They saw their mighty leader falter. They began to whisper again. He exited the meeting with head held high, but inside he could barely walk. That night, he leaned against the cold stone walls of his chambers and realized his body had become a prison. Chains forged not of iron, but of disease and fear. He tasted blood in every breath. He trembled at shadows. The next morning, the armies he once commanded marched past his window. He watched them. They cheered banners with his face. But their cheers sounded distant. He felt nothing. He heard only the drumbeats of betrayal marching behind their feet. He thought of every person around him who might turn, every person who had looked at him and smiled until turning traitor behind his back. One night he dreamed he was burning his flesh. His medals, his robes, everything turned to ashes. Flames licked the air. In the flames stood his image smiling, unburnt. When he woke, his fever had shot higher than ever. His skin felt aflame. He gasped for breath. The air smelled like sulfur. From that point on, the court changed. Servants moved quietly. Generals averted their eyes. Courtiers lingered in doorways but never approached. Mistakes were punished. Obedience became the only prayer. Fear replaced respect. Fear became the currency. He attempted to rally. A speech. In the courtyard, his voice was rough, eyes glazed, but the crowd stood silent afterward. No applause, no tears. They had seen something die in him first. The spirit they once cheered had left his skin. They saw it in his hollow eyes, trembling hands, his silent agony masked behind regal cloak. That was the true turning point, not the wound or the fever. It was when the world no longer believed in him as they once did, when fear replaced love, when loyalty became silence. That moment marked the beginning of the end. Power started to slip like sand through his fingers. Every command felt empty. Every victory tasted like ash. He began to understand the cruelest irony. He had built an empire of loyalty, and now he ruled over ashes. And with every tick of his fevered clock, he felt the final betrayal come. By fate, by body, by people. The same man who once commanded thunder now trembled at his own reflection. The hero, the myth, the voice of nations was becoming nothing more than a fading echo of what he had been. The bedchamber was no longer warm. It was cold and damp. His arm, black and swollen, lay like a dead branch across the bed. Gangrene had claimed most of it, turning flesh into dark mush, pulsing with rot. The stench of decay lingered in the air. Servants placed cloths over there. Noses hurried out or didn't return. No one dared enter unless forced. He slept very little. When he closed his eyes, nightmares came. The same vision. His body aflame, burning without pain, turning to ash. Then it would morph into a swarm of insects crawling under his skin. He woke, screaming, drenched in sweat. He clawed at the sheets with fever-clogged fingers. His breath rancid and ragged. No priest offered a blessing. No doctor dared stay overnight. Instead, they whispered outside the door, "He's beyond healing." His blood thickened in his veins, smelled like copper and fear. He vomited black bile. He coughed until he spat up something that looked like rotten fruit. He could not swallow solid food. He lived on thin soup and water, but thirst haunted him constantly. Isolation grew around him like a wall. Courtiers attended from behind guards, bowed only at a distance. Each went silent as soon as they left his sight, afraid of catching the sickness or something more. He was a living corpse, and yet he was still expected to rule. He stopped leaving. The bed, his throne room, fell silent. Empty chairs lined the hall. His voice, once thunderous, faded into whispers. Advisors spoke in hushed tones in corridors, plotting succession, choosing favorites. He waited for the moment when they would take power. In his brightest days, he had laughed in candlelight with friends. Now he rattled to himself. He chewed on bits of cloth, wrote letters in shaky hand, promising mercy and forgiveness. Tore them up and ate the scraps. He whispered prophecies no one understood. Names, places, wars, death. He scratched the walls. Bare wood, splintered fingertips. His mind unraveled. There were days when he couldn't recognize his own face in the mirror. He stared at his reflection and wept. And then he screamed, as if it was someone else, a stranger staring back at madness. He pleaded with the mirror to tell him what he had done wrong. The glass stared empty. Every breath was torture. Fever made him delirious. He saw shapes in corners, crawling dark things that hissed and whispered. He tried to strike them with shaking fists, but missed. His limbs felt heavy, lifeless. When hallucinations came, they brought voices, calling him traitor, murderer, coward. He believed them. His own thoughts betrayed him. Midnight thunderstorms once heralded his birth. Now storms raged in his mind, lightning in his skull, thunder in his chest. Began to wake up screaming for rain. Not for relief, but because he thought the water would wash him clean. The rain never came. He stayed filthy. His few attendants feared not just his illness, his unpredictability. One mug of soup spilled. Accused the server of poisoning him. Blue lips, cold sweat, clawed at the man's face. "Want to kill me, don't you?" He rasped. Guards restrained him. Servant fled. No one dared look him in the eye again. Paranoia bloomed. He suspected every flower petal dropped in his room, every candle placed by someone's hand. Believed artists painted him as a monster in secret rooms. Believed his friends watched him sleep. He started sleeping in a locked chest at night, just to feel safe. They worried he would suffocate before morning. He refused the bed. His arms seemed to pulse with life and death at once. Black veins, fluid oozing, flies crawling. He smelled it on his blankets, on his robes, even in his clothes when they washed them. Refused drinking cups made of metal. They tasted of death. Drank from wooden bowls carved from old trees. Said they held memory. Less poison. Letters from the outer provinces reached him, reading victories and tributes. Could not remember why people loved him. Ports spoke of festivals in his name. Statues built, songs sung, but he felt none of it. Instead, he pressed his hand to his chest at night and felt only emptiness. Wondered if the people who praised him would regret it when he died. Doctors tried one desperate surgery. In dim lamplight, attempted to cut the dead flesh away. Anesthesia failed. He shrieked. The room smelled like burning flesh. Stopped. The lead surgeon vomited. The assistants fled. Refused to try again. Lay in bed for days afterward. Delirious fever scorching. Saw crowds marching on him, burying him alive. Saw his own skeleton crowned and seated. Throne. He shook his head at the visions. Terrified him more than the pain. Wept for his own death before it came. The palace stunk, all stained with vomit and sweat. Dust-colored streaks reminded attendants of spilled wine, but no wine had spilled. He refused bedding. Guards changed linen nightly, but he rubbed it off. Smell lingered. Rats came. Small creatures chewed at the edges of the curtains. Eyes buzzed inside his mind as much as outside. No prayer chased them away. Hands left quietly. Those he once embraced now avoided him. Said it was health. He knew it was fear. Then his doctor stopped visiting. Claimed the risk was too great. Night he called out for anyone to hold his hand. Silence answered that he lost strength by the hour. Flesh melted off his bones, yet fever raged. He coughed blood. Times he thought his heart would burst. Slept standing up because laying down made him feel trapped. Feared the air would suffocate him. He stayed upright, leaning on guards, shivering in lamplight. He stopped speaking in sentences. He muttered words, then single words, then silence. He stared at his hands for hours, as if waiting for them to move. At night, he scribbled a single line in a journal. "I'm alone." And nothing. Days passed before attendants noticed. Not moved. Clothes stained. Beside bed overflowed. Guards opened the chest. He was not inside. They searched. Lay on the floor, unconscious, breathing shallow. Carried him to bed. Opened his eyes, saw them, and cried. A groan that echoed down the halls. They thought delirium caused it. Maybe. But after that, he spoke. One sentence. "Burn the clothes." No one asked why. They obeyed. He expired 2 hours later. He died in that forsaken chamber. Water-stained walls and dark shadows for witnesses. As the last breath slipped from him, silence swallowed everything. The final heartbeat echoed like a judgment. His attendants held their breath. Fear had grown thick enough to smother sound. For a long moment, no one dared claim he was dead. Then whispered confirmations, tears, backs turned, hurried bows. They would not look at him again. His eyes remained half open, pupils fixed in grotesque emptiness. The bedclothes were soaked with sweat, bile, and blood. Guards swiped it away stiffly. No one touched his body without gloves. No one looked at his face. They wrapped him in cloth so old it felt rough, stained in places where rot had soaked through. A priest refused to accompany the body to the altar. Another offered reluctant chants, whispered under his breath as he stood far from the corpse. Death had become too close, too forbidden. Then came the burning. They laid out his final clothes on a stone slab, the same garments he wore in delirium, soaked in death's scents, torn by his own fevered hands. At first, they hesitated, but his final words had been simple. "Burn the clothes." That command outweighed tradition. It echoed in everyone's minds. They believed those garments held his curse or his spirit. They lit the fire in the courtyard. At midnight, announcers forbid any from entering. The crackle of flames sounded like whispers. People watched at a distance, shielding their eyes. The fabric burned black and silver. Ash spiraled into moonlit air. It rose like ghost, smoke like prayers turned to dust. One attendant recorded in a trembling voice how the fire seemed to glow unnatural shades. Blue embers flickered where there should have only been red heat. People recoiled. They claimed the wind carried faint echoes of his voice, hoarse, pleading, broken. Others said they heard laughter and the flames mocking calls from beyond. Was it the cloth burning, or something trapped inside? Meanwhile, in the palace, life resumed too quickly. Courtiers returned, bowed, filled the silence with chatter. But all beneath the surface trembled. His death had left a void that no ceremony could fill. Generals disputed succession in secret rooms. Servants whispered that his ghost roamed the palace corridors at night, whispering curses. There were rumors of dreams. People from distant provinces reported the same nightmare. A man on fire, reaching arms toward them with blackened flesh. He was pleading. They woke gasping. Some denied worshipping him before. Now they wept. Death had transformed him into legend or damnation. His body lay in a coffin made of dark wood. But the coffin sat empty. The flesh had turned too foul. They refused to bury it. Some high priests insisted on cremation. Others argued for entombment. Fear won. They had buried the clothes. Now they feared the man himself. Some nights guards thought they saw the coffin shift. A clatter in the crypt. Heavy breathing in dark halls. Dogs streaked past corridors, tongues lapping at empty graves. They said the animals sensed something. That something stirred beneath the ground. Friends who once greeted him with joy now avoided his memory. At official memorials, speeches felt hollow. They built statues in his memory, but never placed his face. A blank visage on marble markers. Rumors spread that anyone who carved his likeness suffered illness or misfortune soon after. Power had left behind nothing but fear, yet fragments of loyalty remained. A few disciples smuggled scraps of his writings, letters in torn leather, a lock of his hair, the corpse's ring. They preserved them as relics, dangerous, forbidden relics. They hid them underground, passing them hand to hand, whispering his name in secret. Some said those who held the relics had vivid dreams of him, debating strategy, promising justice, bracing for final battle. In the dreams, his wounds healed. His voice rang clear again. In death, they invented the man as he once. His irony clung to his story like shadow. A ruler who lived for loyalty was abandoned in sickness. A man who healed nations died from an infection. A leader who freed people was trapped in a prison of his own body. Even his death was a betrayal. As seasons changed, guards rotated, walls wore new paint, the palace halls hummed with new voices. Still, occasionally, someone froze mid-step. A whisper. Did you hear footsteps in the echoing corridor? They looked behind them and saw nothing. Stillness answered. A second heartbeat in the air. Years later, poets wrote sermons about him. Historians called him tragic genius. Philosophers asked, what happens when power meets mortality? But in the old quarters of the palace, beyond tapestries and court songs, legend lingered. The smell of decay in a silent room. The flicker of blue sparks in the night. The clothes burned at midnight. He roamed, they said, not to harm, but to remind. His death did not end him. It changed him into a ghost story. A chilling lesson whispered across generations. And in that eerie transition between flesh and memory, between flames and silence, his legacy became a warning. No matter how high you rise, the abyss waits. And what of his choices? He built an empire, but it cost him his soul. Trusted few, betrayed many. In time, the very people he protected feared to touch his skin. Court that once clapped at his footsteps burned his clothes like poison. There's no loyalty in fear, no love in obedience. Philosopher Layla Haroun once said, to hold power is to dig your own grave with a golden shovel. That's what he did. He dug slowly, with pride, with war, with control. And when he reached the bottom, he was alone. It's easy to worship a man when he stands tall. But what do we do when he falls, when his body collapses, when his mind turns against him? We turn away. We pretend the decay isn't there. And then we bury him. And still people remember him. Not just as a ruler. As a warning, he reminds us that all glory fades. All flesh fails. That even the strongest hands will tremble. Even the clearest voices will one day stutter and fade. Legacy is not just in battles or laws. It is in the silence after the crowds are gone. The burn marks where his final clothes turn to ash. The halls where his name still echoes. His footsteps do not. He is not remembered with joy, or entirely with sorrow. He is remembered with a kind of reverence, a fear, a question, a lesson. Good is power if it dies with you. Good is fame if it ends in screams. Good is glory if no one dares touch your body when you fall. He ruled many. At the end, he ruled nothing. Not his pain, not his mind, not even the fire that burned his final garments. And still, tell his story, not because he was perfect, because he was human. And every human, even the most powerful, carries the seeds of their downfall within them. Let that be the lesson. Build your empire if you must. Rise high, wear the crown. Man the world. Never forget, the higher you go, the more painful the fall. When the final hour comes, when the fever burns and the walls close in, we be remembered not for our riches, but for our mercy, for our throne, for our truth. Not the flames we lit in war, but the light we left behind. Because in the end, only one thing survives, the story. How we are remembered is the only true legacy we leave. Story is not a triumph. Is a mirror, held up to every man and woman who seeks power, who craves respect, believes themselves untouchable. In that mirror, we must all ask, when my time comes, what will they burn and what will remain? Is the final question. That is the weight of history. At the cost of power.